I'd sent Margot Calder exactly one bouquet in 18 years, and her assistant had it back on my porch within the hour, card unopened, with a typed note explaining that Miss Calder did not accept gifts from local vendors during active estate and development proceedings. I stood there holding flowers I'd grown with my own hands and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite surprise. I'd had 18 years to get used to silence from that family. I just hadn't expected it delivered with a cover letter. It started, the way most things in Sutton Ridge eventually do, at Founders Square. Margot's father, Walton Calder, had run half this county from behind a mahogany desk for 40 years, and when he passed in March, the company he'd built, hers now, sent survey crews downtown with stakes and orange flags. They meant to pave the square. Turn the oldest public garden in 3 counties into parking for the mixed-use tower going up where the old feed store used to stand. I knew that garden better than anyone alive. I planted a bed of larkspur along its east fence the spring after Margot left for college and never came home, tall, stubborn, deep blue flowers that returned every year whether a soul watered them or not. I'd tended that bed quietly every season since, the way a man tends a grave he visits but doesn't talk about. Folks in town assumed the flower farmer just liked keeping the square pretty. Nobody ever asked why one corner looked better cared for than my own front yard. I never told them. Margot and I had grown up 2 streets apart, and from 16 until the September she left for school, neither of us could remember a single day we didn't love the other one. Walton never thought a nursery owner's son amounted to much of a future for his only daughter, and he said so plainly, more than once, across that same mahogany desk. I still remember the night before she left, the 2 of us on her mother's porch swing, shelling peas neither one of us cared about just to have an excuse to sit close in the dark a little longer. Walton came out onto the steps once, didn't say a word, just stood there until I understood it was time to go home. When Margot left, I wrote her every week that whole first semester, real letters, mailed from the post office on Court Street, the kind a boy writes when he still believes distance is the only thing standing between him and the rest of his life. Every one went unanswered. By December I told myself she'd simply outgrown me, outgrown Sutton Ridge, and a man can only knock on a closed door so many times before he has to believe what the silence is telling him. So I let her go. I grieved it the way you grieve anything you can't keep, and a few years later I married a good, steady woman named Renee, built this nursery up from 2 greenhouses and a tractor, and was about as happy as I had any right to be, until Renee passed when our daughter Hazel was 4, and it was just the 2 of us and the flowers after that. What I never stopped doing, and couldn't have told you exactly why, was writing Margot 1 letter a year, every September, on the date she'd left, never mailed, never meant to be. Renee knew. She found the first one before we married and told me a man who could love that hard, that quietly, and never once make her feel like second place, was a man worth keeping. She never asked me to stop, and by the time she passed, the letters weren't longing anymore so much as a man taking stock once a year, what he'd built, what he'd lost, what he still believed in. I kept 18 of them folded in a cedar box in my workshop. I never expected another living soul to read one. So when the survey stakes went into Founders Square, I did the only thing that made sense to a man who'd spent his whole life growing things. I cut the best larkspur I had, wrote a short card explaining what that bed of flowers was, and asked her, before anything got torn up, to come see it once. I sent it to the only Calder left in town to ask. She sent it back unopened. That was the morning this whole thing started. Hazel found me standing in the greenhouse that evening, staring at a tray of seedlings I wasn't really seeing. "Dad. You're doing the jaw thing again." She was 8 and missed nothing that mattered. I told her some flowers just don't land where you throw them, and she accepted that the way 8-year-olds accept most adult foolishness, with a shrug and a question about whether we had ice cream. The town council took up the Founders Square plan 4 nights later, and half of Sutton Ridge packed the old courthouse to hear it. Margot stood up front in a gray suit, composed and precise, walking the council through site plans and parking projections like the square was a line item and not the place half this county had its first kiss. "The square generates no revenue and costs the county $11,000 a year to maintain," she said, and a woman 2 rows up muttered something about counting what mattered instead of what only paid, and got a few quiet nods for it. I sat in the back with Hazel on my knee and didn't say a word, because pride doesn't argue with people in public, and because some part of me still couldn't look at her without seeing 22 and the morning she drove away. Hazel, who has never once in her life met a stranger, slipped off my lap during the coffee break and walked straight up to Margot by the courthouse steps. "You're the lady who's going to dig up Dad's flowers," she said, not unkindly, just stating a fact. "He says the blue ones are for somebody special. He won't say who." I got to them in time to see something cross Margot's face that had nothing to do with parking decks. She didn't say much to me that night. But 3 days later, near dusk, I drove past Founders Square and saw her standing alone at the east fence, in jeans instead of the gray suit, one hand resting on the larkspur like she was checking it was real. I didn't stop the car. Some things a person has to feel through alone before anybody else is allowed in. The call from Pearl Anders came the next morning. Pearl had run that office for 30 years and was the only person in it with a kind word for everybody, including me. She said Margot was going through her father's papers for the estate and had found something with my handwriting on it, mixed in with the legal files, and asked would I come by the old Calder house. I almost didn't go. I convinced myself I had no pride left where that family was concerned, and then spent the whole drive over checking my collar in the rearview mirror like I was 22 again. Margot opened the door herself. 18 years older, every bit as composed as the photographs I'd seen of her in the business section over the years, and for half a second before she caught herself, something in her face cracked clean open, like she'd seen a ghost standing on her father's porch. "Pearl said you had something of mine," I said. "I have a box with your handwriting on it," she said. I didn't open it. "I wanted you here when I did." We sat at the same kitchen table where Walton Calder once told me, flatly, that I'd amount to dirt under his daughter's shoes. She lifted the lid off a cedar box I'd never seen in my life, and inside were every letter I'd mailed her that first semester, stamped, postmarked, never delivered. I recognized my own handwriting from a lifetime ago, looping in earnest, the hand of a boy who still believed he could write his way back into somebody's life. One line near the top of the first letter caught my eye before I could stop myself. "I don't care what your father thinks I am, Margot. I only care what you think I could become." I hadn't thought about that line in 18 years, and reading it again in her kitchen nearly undid me as much as it plainly undid her. Walton had told the college mailroom he'd forward her correspondence himself, and instead brought every single one home and locked it in his desk. On top, in handwriting gone shaky with age, sat a note he'd written 2 weeks before he died. "I told myself I was protecting her future," it read. "I took something from both of you I had no right to take, and I have not had one good night's sleep over it since the day I did it. If either of you ever finds this, I am asking you to forgive an old man who was so afraid of losing his daughter that he made certain she lost something better instead." Margot read it twice. I watched 18 years of careful composure come apart, quietly, at her father's kitchen table, and I didn't say a word, because grief and reckoning deserve room to breathe before anybody else steps in. "You wrote every week," she finally said. "I thought you stopped after a month. He told me you'd moved on, that you'd asked him to tell me not to bother writing back." "I never stopped, that whole semester," I said. "After that, I figured the silence was you telling me something." I didn't know it was him telling me anything at all. She asked, very quietly, if I'd kept writing since. I told her about the cedar box in my own workshop, 18 letters, one a year, every September, never mailed, never meant for anyone's eyes but my own conscience. I told her about the larkspur, planted the spring after she left and tended every season since, not because I expected her back but because some part of a man keeps tending what he loved even after he stopped expecting it to bloom for anybody. I told her about Renee, and Hazel, and a life that had been good and full and entirely real, and that none of it made the garden, or the letters, one bit less true. A man can love more than one thing across a lifetime and still mean every bit of all of it. She thanked me, quiet and a little undone, and I drove home that evening not at all certain what I'd just set in motion. She was at the nursery before I'd even unlocked the greenhouse the next morning, jeans, hair down, looking less like the CEO of Calder Holdings than like the girl who used to climb the back fence of my father's flower beds at 16. Hazel found her first, out by the larkspur cuttings near the front gate, and announced, with the full authority of an 8-year-old, that she'd been right about the blue ones all along. Margot looked at me over my daughter's head and smiled, really smiled, for what I think was the first time in 18 years. "The square's off the development plan," she said. "I called the council at 6 this morning. All of it stays. We're naming the garden bequest after my father, because he was wrong about a great many things, but he was right that I needed to come home and see exactly what I'd left behind." "That include the flower farmer?" I asked. "I'm working on that part," she said. Give me 18 days. I think I've earned the right to take it slower than 18 years, this time. I told her I'd waited this long. 18 days I could manage. She comes by most evenings now, after the office closes, and helps Hazel water the bed of larkspur that's bloomed every spring for 18 years running, whether a soul was watching or not. I never set out to prove anything to anybody when I planted those first stems. I only couldn't bring myself to let something that mattered that much go to seed and weeds simply because the world had decided it was finished. Last week, Hazel asked me, while we were closing up the greenhouse, whether I was ever sorry I'd kept writing those letters all those years, never once sending a one of them. I told her no. I told her a man doesn't water a garden because he's certain something will bloom. He waters it because the watering is the truest thing he knows how to do, and because somewhere underneath all that waiting, he still believes the ground is listening. She thought about that for a minute, the way she thinks about most things, and then she asked if that meant we could plant more larkspur along the front walk, since Margot liked them so much. I told her that sounded about right. These days, when Margot pulls into the drive after work, Hazel's usually already out at the cuttings, narrating the whole bed like a tour guide who's been doing this for years instead of weeks. I stand back by the greenhouse door and watch the two of them and think about a boy who once wrote letters into the dark, never once expecting an answer. Turns out the things a man tends faithfully, long after anyone expects him to, are usually the things that end up tending him back.